Welcome everyone. I'm delighted to be here to be part of Elevate 2021, and I'd like to thank Appeon for organizing the conference and inviting me. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about how you can optimize automated testing for PowerBuilder, PowerServer, and PowerClient. And of course I'll be using the latest version of PowerBuilder 2021. Just put the disclaimer up there for a second. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to give you a good introduction to AscentialTest. And for those of you that don't know, AscentialTest is an automated testing tool for the GUI and for beyond the GUI, as you'll learn. I'm going to be focusing on PowerBuilder, PowerServer, and PowerClient in today's presentation. And I'll start out by talking about application object definitions for PowerBuilder applications. I'm going to explain how we create steps and then use those steps to build automated tests. I'll be executing the same set of tests against a PowerBuilder, a PowerServer, and a PowerClient application. And you'll see that I'm able to use one set of tests to run against the three different deployments of the application. I'm also going to talk about support that we've implemented for some recent PowerBuilder features. The new ribbons. I'll talk about how we have REST support, just like REST support is built into PowerBuilder now, and support for the new embedded Chrome. We've always supported the embedded Internet Explorer, but now we're also offering embedded Chrome support. So if you have a PowerBuilder application that embeds a browser, we have that support built right into AscentialTest. I'm Brian Lesueur. I'm the CEO of Xenix Software. As you can see from my skills, I'm very heavily involved in test automation, test tool development, test planning, and so forth. Our most recent project is AscentialTest 9.8, and also we built some plugins because we're supporting continuous integration just like PowerBuilder. We've got a new plugin for Azure and a new plugin for Jenkins. Xenix is the creator of AscentialTest, which is an enterprise-level test management system that encompasses test planning, automated and manual test development, test data management, and execution. Our mission is really to provide a tool where users can build robust manual and automated tests from reusable components that are created without recording or scripting. And you'll be seeing that as I go through the presentation. Some ways here to connect with your Appeon community. Now, AscentialTest is now a comprehensive testing suite. When we first started out, it was an automated testing tool, and that was more than 10 years ago now, but the suite has been built out so that we have a lot of different modules now to support the whole life cycle of your project development and deployment. We start with test planning, which is where a lot of our QA customers will start accessing the tool, writing your test plans. And of course, we're best known still for our automated testing support, but we also support manual testing. And we have a module that's dedicated to test data management. I will talk about test execution quite a lot in this presentation because, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to be executing a set of tests against PowerBuilder, PowerServer, and PowerClient. And I'll also introduce you to our metrics and reporting modules. Now, AscentialTest is integrated with other tools like defect tracking Today we're integrated with Jira for defect tracking, but very soon we'll be integrated with Azure DevOps for defect tracking as well. We're integrated with Subversion for version control, but very soon we'll be integrated with both Git and TFS. For continuous integration, we have plugins for both Jenkins and Azure DevOps. And because AscentialTest has a very robust command line, you can execute anything from the command line that you can from within AscentialTest. We can easily integrate with any continuous integration solutions. Let's take a look at a typical usage configuration. Now, AscentialTest is a testing tool that operates on your desktop, and it talks to a license manager. Now, your test projects are stored in a database, and as I mentioned, we support Subversion already. Your test data can be in any database that you would like it to support your test results. AscentialTest can run on the local machine, but it can also run on any other machine in your network. And you would run something that we call a runtime. So you can connect to one machine or multiple machines at the same time in order to execute a suite of tests. Maybe you want to increase your throughput and get your tests run a lot faster, so instead of running on a single machine, you might choose to run on multiple machines. If you do that, all the results are sent back to AscentialTest where you can generate your reports. You can look at the reports through AscentialTest or through a web browser application that we provide. I'm going to talk about a couple of different libraries in this presentation, but the first library that I want to talk about is the object library. There are several different kinds of objects in a PowerBuilder application. Most of them are what we call app objects. And these objects would be things like your PB pop-up lists, your push buttons, your PB text fields, of course your data windows, in whatever form they're in, whether it's what we call a PB form or a PB table. And that table can be presented in many different ways. It can be tabular, it can be a grid, and so forth. It could be a tree view. Doesn't matter in AscentialTest. We see all of the PowerBuilder objects that are available, including the new ribbon. Now we also have image objects. Image objects is where there is a graphic painted onto a canvas. Well, we can see that as an image. In fact, that's how we handled the older toolbar in PowerBuilder. Text objects. This is where text is rendered onto a screen or a canvas. And we can turn some text into an object. Once we do that, the objects look just like as if they were real objects with a real handle. You wouldn't really know the difference. And as I mentioned, this is a stable foundation that we base our testing project. AscentialTest is a very object-oriented test tool. So we build all of our test actions, our steps, our tests, our plans. They're all built on this object library. What's important to you is that when you get a new release of your application, you will update the definitions of these objects without impacting the rest of your project. AscentialTest will automatically update the rest of your testing projects when you maintain or change these object definitions to match any changes in the target application. Let's take a little bit of a deeper look. Object definitions for application elements are stored in a library. App objects are only referred to by name, so there's a mapping between the name of an object and its definition. That's how we get the isolation between your tests and the objects. We want to insulate your tests from changes in the target application, so when the target application changes, it doesn't break all of your scripts. That's a very, very important concept. So if an application element changes, you only have to change the definition that requires a change. The automated tests will require no changes. Now, objects are defined using something called an AscentialTest snapshot. Let's take a look at a snapshot now. A snapshot is made up of 3 different components: the application image, and as you'll see in a little while when we look at this application, in fact most of you are probably familiar with it because it is the sales demo application that PowerBuilder provides for training purposes. So here we have a snapshot. This isn't the real application that we're looking at, it's a snapshot, and you can see we've even painted these all buttons on here, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Now, along with the image, we have developed something called the elements tree. This is our own panel, and you can think of it as a document object model for a PowerBuilder application. If you look at it, you can see right away that it's made up of all the elements that make up the PowerBuilder application. You can see some PB tables here, and inside of this table that's been expanded you can see the detail, and there's a row, and then if I was to expand more here you'd see in the row there are columns and so forth. Now whatever object is selected here in the elements tree, we will see its attributes. These are the attributes of the selected element. We use those attributes to locate and to interact with the application objects. This is how we can verify, for example, the value that might be in a field if that's something that you want to do in one of your tests. Now, with that snapshot, we create something called an object definition. And here we're looking at an AppObjects file. This is a file called appobjects.z, and in that file we have defined all of the objects. I'm going to show you in just a few minutes how we create these definitions. It's a drag and drop process. I'm dragging from the snapshot, that snapshot image, over to the AppObjects files. And if you look here at the definition that I've created for presentation purposes, you can see we've got an MDI child called product defined. Inside of that definition, we've got a PB pop-up table called ID. We've got a PB table, and in that PB table there's a row and some columns. And that's the products table that we're looking at. Again, I'm going to talk in more detail about this in a little bit. So let's go ahead now and move to a demonstration so that I can demonstrate for you how we create those app objects. I'll start out by explaining that UA server, which is our testing agent, is hooked into the application. And you can see that because I've got PB sales demo checked here in the UA server, and you can see the process ID. That tells you that AscentialTest is hooked into the application at runtime. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to hold down my control key and hit the shift key, and you notice this small dialog box popped up that said snapshot captured. Now here we are in AscentialTest, and this is the snapshot that I just took. I'm just going to enlarge it for you a little bit. Over here in the elements tree, you can see the elements that make up this snapshot. So if I click on this table here, you'll see this is the upper table on this particular page. And if I expand the table, we'll see that AscentialTest recognizes the header. Notice as I click on each one of the elements in the header, they light up in yellow. And also the PB detail, which is the body of the table. In this particular case, there are 3 rows at runtime, And if I click on each of the columns in that row, those will light up as well. Now, of course, if you're running a test and there was hundreds of rows in this table, at runtime, AscentialTest would see the number of rows that were present at the given time that the test was run. As I said earlier, for each one of those elements, if I click on the element, we see all the attributes of that particular element. So you can see in this case that the value of this field is 1. Whereas if I click in this column, the text of this particular field is bikes. And you see it in the text attribute of this element. Now I'd like to show you how we create an object definition. I'm going to do that for this MDI child. I'm going to go ahead and take my mouse and put it over the MDI child in the element, and I'm going to simply drag it and drop it across like that. And you'll notice we created an app object definition for the MDI child. I'm going to just drag over one of these definitions for you. I'll just pick this table right here, kind of at random, drag it over and drop it. And I want you to notice that we defined the PB table. We defined the row class, and notice when I click on that, the rows in the table light up. And if I expand this here, and if I click on one of the columns, notice the columns light up. So AscentialTest knows everything there is to know from a GUI point of view about this PB table, this data window. Now let's take a look at a definition that I've already worked with. I've actually fully defined this particular page, not just the MDI in the table. If I click on this object here, we notice that there's a drop-down. This is a PB pop-up table. And if I look at it in the elements tree, you'll notice that we see not only the table, but we see all of the elements or the items that are in the table as well. But I want to talk about how we define the PB pop-up table. A definition of the PB pop-up table includes 3 components. The class of the component, in this case it's a PB pop-up table. The name of the element, we call that the object name, and we assign the object name, ID. We're actually getting that out of the 3rd component that I'm about to talk about, which is the path. Now, if you would prefer a different name, that's easy enough to do. You just right-click on the object and say rename. Dialog box pops up, and you can rename that object to be anything you like it to be. And in fact, if you've even referred to the object, AscentialTest will refactor the entire project for you. The 3rd component of the definition is this object that we call here the path of the object. In PowerBuilder, the path is most of the time made up of something called the object name. So we have an attribute in PowerBuilder called @objectName, and that's assigned normally a unique identifier. So the object name makes a very, very robust path in a PowerBuilder application. There's one more thing that I'd like to explain about the object definition we have in front of us. I'm going to expand the products table again. And remember, we've got the table, we've got the columns. We've also got this component called the selector. Selector is very important in a PowerBuilder application because we have so many tables. And what a selector does is it allows us to select a row based on a value in the row. So imagine you're creating a test case and you want to interact in your test with a particular row. Well, a selector allows you to do that very easily. I have a selector here that's based on the product ID. And by the way, you can create as many selectors as you want on any of the columns, and you can even combine them. But in this case, I've got a simple selector on the product ID column. If you look at the path of this selector, it reads as such. Find me the row that contains the PB object with the object name product ID, and the text is like select by product ID, which is the selector. Now watch what happens when I put a value in the field. If I put in 287, AscentialTest finds the row that has 287 in the product ID column. A little bit later on in the demonstration, I'm going to show you how we use that selector to locate a row in a running test. Now let's return to our slides and start talking about how we build tests with AscentialTest. Earlier in this presentation, I talked about the object library. Now I want to talk about another library that we call the step library. In AscentialTest, tests are built from units that we call steps. A step is made up of actions. Actions are things like clicking on push buttons or putting text into text fields, selecting a row in a data window. Those are all actions, and they make up our steps. What's important about this step library is that it not only increases your maintainability of your tests, but it also increases your productivity. Once you create a step, you never have to create it again. You can use that step in as many tests as you like. But what's important is that if the target application changes, and that requires a change to one of these steps, you can make the change in one place, and then all the tests are automatically updated for you. So again, this drastically increases the maintainability of your tests, and it also impacts your productivity. Now getting back to objects and their relation to steps, I want to point out this particular object here called product number. It's a PB text field, and you see it highlighted. What I want you to notice that on this step, and this is a step in AscentialTest, you can see that it is made up of a number of actions, setting values to fields, clicking buttons, and so forth. We're going to talk in a lot more detail about this in a moment. But what I want you to notice right now is that in this particular action, the product number is referred to only by name. There are no references inside the step to the implementation of that object, only the name of the object. That's important, again, because if the object changes, if something about the object changes, you only need to go to the one place in order to make the change to the definition of the object. Make that change, and the tests are unaffected by that change, because again, they're only referring to the object by its name. Let's go back and look at AscentialTest again, and this time we're going to focus on how we build steps. Now that we're back in AscentialTest, I'd like to show you what a step looks like. So On the left-hand side here, I have a step called Update Product Detail. I've given it a description, adds or updates the product detail. And I've provided a group. Groups allow us to organize our steps. Makes them easier to locate later on when you're building tests, which we will talk about in just a little bit. You'll notice if I hover my mouse over the step, you see the description that I put into the description field. Again, this helps you understand what these particular steps actually represent. So we've got a step over here on the left, and you'll notice the snapshot on the right. Now I want to draw your attention to the panel that's below the snapshot image. We call this area here the Actions panel. Its purpose is to allow us to easily add actions to our steps without having to do any scripting. You'll notice that in this panel there are different types of actions that I can generate. Actions that will set values to a field. Actions that will perform verification. Actions that will get values from the application. Events, that would be things like clicking on the mouse or moving the mouse, hovering the mouse maybe over a drop-down. And then everything else. I'm going to demonstrate this for you in just a moment, but I just want to explain the panel first. You'll notice also in my step that I've created over here, I've got a number of actions that will set values to the various fields on the application page that is represented right now by the snapshot. You'll notice there's different kinds of fields actually on this page. There are drop-downs, there are text fields, there are radio lists. But the user doesn't have to worry about the fact that there are different kinds of objects on the page, because if we want to set a value to one of those fields, it's always going to be set. AscentialTest knows what type of object it is, so internally it'll call the right action in order to set a value. You really only need to know that you want to set a value to the field. You'll notice also that there is no data hard-coded into this step. And the reason for that is we want these steps to be reusable so that they can be used with many sets of data over and over and over again. If we put the data right into the step, then that would limit the number of tests, perhaps to only one test, that we could utilize the step. By parameterizing it, we can use the step in as many tests as we like. And you'll notice the parameters are located right up here. I'm going to demonstrate that for you again in a moment. So let's go ahead and take a look at how this works. So I've got a little step here just called Demo Step so that I can show you how this Actions panel works. If I want to set a value to this field here, the Product ID field, I put my cursor in the field and I can simply drag over, and you'll see that the set action is automatically generated. I can do them one by one, like that, or what's faster is I can hold down the Control key and I can click in any number of fields and then drag them all over as a group. Much faster to do that. I want to show you that aside from set, we can do other types of actions. For example, if I want to verify the value of this field, I can do that. I can drag that verify over, or I can click on the append button or the insert button. I can verify more than just the value. I can verify whether or not the field is active or if it's enabled, for example. I can also get values. I can get all of the different attributes that I can verify. As I mentioned earlier, events are keyboard and mouse events. So for example, if I wanted to type keys, if I wanted to double-click something, hover my mouse, I can select that as an event. And then everything else that didn't fit into one of the other categories, we group under Other. So for example, if I want to wait for a window to exist, I can give it a timeout. That's the maximum amount of time. Decide what we're going to do. If the window doesn't display, I can choose an exception, which would halt the test, raise an error, raise a warning, or do nothing. Maybe I'm just using it for synchronization. And again, I can add it to my test by either dragging and dropping or by clicking one of the buttons down below. Now you will notice that there are values that are hard-coded into the steps. But if I don't want those hard-coded values, and in most cases I don't, I can simply highlight the fields, hold down my Shift key and I'll click and I'll highlight all of those particular actions. I go to my Data button and I select Add Parameters. And when I do that and click OK, AscentialTest automatically creates a parameter for me in the right type, and it binds that parameter to the action, all just by clicking on a button. This is important because, again, it makes our steps reusable. We can use those steps over and over again in as many tests as we like. That's important, again, because if the target application changes, I can come here and change only the step, but all the tests that use that step will be unaffected by that change. They're essentially automatically updated. Now let's go back and take a look at some slides that will explain how tests are created in AscentialTest using these steps. Now that we've talked about how to build a step, let's look at how tests are built from reusable steps in AscentialTest. What we're looking at in this slide is a test. The name of this test is called Add Product. And what it does is it adds a new bicycle to the sales demo application. You'll notice that my test is made up of a number of steps. That blue keyword step indicates the step. Over on the left is a library of steps. This is what I talked about earlier when we talked about that library. Here it is. You'll notice that the steps are in groups. So I've got a group called Add Entity. There's a number of entity actions like adding an entity, deleting an entity, saving an entity, and so forth. And remember, if this was live and I hovered my mouse over the step, you'd see the description. It's quite easy to develop tests in AscentialTest. It's really just drag and drop. You take your mouse and you put your mouse on the step that you want to drag over, and you simply drag it and drop it. And when you do, the step shows up inside of the test. Now, the slide that we're looking at shows the test as it's already been bound to a data table. I'll be showing you how we do that live, because you're probably noticing these names here. These names are referring to the table and to the column in the table. This is a data-driven test, and the data is coming from this table that is called product data. Again, I'll demonstrate how this is done live in just a couple of moments. Now, once we have tests, we're going to want to execute them. And so I have a test plan. And I have an Appeon sales demo regression. And in that regression, I've got some tests that are going to add a product. So I'm adding a new bicycle to the database. and I've taken that test that I created called add product and I dragged it over to my test plan and dropped it. When I did that, this green T shows up indicating that there's an automated test that's been linked to this branch of the test plan. Now you notice that I have add a new bike to an existing category. I could now have as many instances of that test as I like, because what I'm doing is I'm also integrating that with a row in a data table that's been bound to the test. So this particular test here, the one that's highlighted, is using the data in the row TC01, test case 01, as you'll see in a moment. If I were to add another test, I might bind that to TC02. So I can reuse my automated test over and over again with different sets of data. Here's a quick look at the data table. Notice there's the row TC01, and here's the data that I'm going to be passing into my test. You'll see that data going into the test when I execute it for you in just a few minutes. What's really important is that with AscentialTest support for PowerBuilder, PowerServer, and PowerClient, I can take that same plan made up of a set of tests and I can drag it over to a suite multiple times. As you can see, I've done in this slide. And I've got instances of the same plan. One instance for PowerServer, one for PowerBuilder, and another for PowerClient. Without making any changes at all to my tests, I'm able to execute my plan against each one of these Appeon platforms. When a test is executed in AscentialTest, you get a result, like the one that we're looking at here. I purposely showed you a slide where there are some errors. Up at the top here, you'll notice that AscentialTest is keeping track of the tests that you have in your test set. This is a pretty small one. There's just 6 automated tests, a couple against each one of the platforms. Of the 6 tests that were executed, 4 have passed and 2 have failed. You notice right away the ones that failed, they have the red X. So in this particular run of the suite, the PowerServer tests both failed, and so we see the red X, whereas the tests in PowerBuilder and PowerClient have passed, and that's why you see the green check mark. Whatever test is highlighted in the top portion of this screen, the detail will be displayed down below. And here you can see a trace of the execution, so all the steps that were executed and all the actions that were executed in those tests. Again, we're going to have a look at that live as we return to our next demo. Before I go over the mechanics of how you create a test in AscentialTest, let's review the test that we looked at in the slide. Here's that test called add product, and you notice that it does include a number of steps. First step will invoke the product screen, where we'll select a product category. Then we're going to click on add new product and then put in the details of that product. We'll save it and then verify it, and we're verifying it in the database itself. I'm going to show this step in detail in a little while so that you can see how we can verify directly on the database. And finally, we delete the entity from the database. Now let's learn about the mechanics of how we go about creating that test. I started a test already called demo test, and I want to show you that all you need to do to create a test in AscentialTest is take your steps from the step library over here and just drag them and drop them. So the first thing we're going to do is invoke product, and then we're going to select the product category. We'll add a new product, update the product details, save the entity, verify it on the database, and then finally delete the entity. So you can see that creating a test in AscentialTest is quite easy. It's just a drag and drop process. You'll also notice that all these little boxes are empty. They're empty because this is where parameters will be placed. Actually, you could put the data right into the test if you want to. You can put data right into those boxes and execute the test. But if you did that, this would be a single-use test. It wouldn't be a data-driven test, which in many cases is what you want. But in most cases, you probably want these to be data-driven tests. So what I'm going to do is highlight all of the steps that make up this test and click on this button here that says Bind Data Table. AscentialTest knows all the parameters in each one of the steps, and it even knows their types. You can see that not all the types are the same. There's a real number here. All I have to do is put in the name of a table that I want generated and click this button, and AscentialTest will automatically create the data table for me. All I have left to do now is just key in the data. So creating a test in AscentialTest is dragging and dropping. You don't need to worry about creating the data table. AscentialTest will do that for you. Now let's take a look at how we get the test into the plan. So I have a test plan here, which is very similar to the one that we looked at in the slide. And in order to integrate my test with my test plan, I come over to the library, and now I'm interested in the test part of the library, not the steps. And I can take that test. I'll take the one that I had originally created, and I'm going to drag it over and drop it. You notice when I do that, the green T shows up, indicating that there's an automated test associated with this branch. The only thing I have left to do is select the row in the data table that contains the test data for this particular instance of the test. To do that, I'm just going to click on this little icon, and since I want this to be TCO1, I'm going to double click on the 1, and you'll notice that the diamond shades in with a blue color to indicate that this test now has its data, there's the row, TCO1, so it can be executed. Now if I had multiple rows in my data table, I could select another row for my next test. These tests are now all data-driven, and the ones that have their data can be executed. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to take a look at that verification step that I talked about earlier. One of the steps in our test was to verify that that new product got added to the database. Let's take a quick look at that step. AscentialTest can not only test the PowerBuilder GUI application, it can also test the back end. And in this particular case, we're talking about connecting to a database, executing some SQL. In this case, I'm doing a select. So I'm selecting some of the attributes of that product that I put into the database. And I'm going to fetch what came back from the execute, and then compare it. I have a verify value here. I'm going to compare what came back from the database to what I expected to be in the database, and you can see that I passed in my expected results as an input parameter to this step. That's all done by drag and drop. You'll notice there's a database class here. And in order to get these actions, all I did was take and drag and drop. That's really all there is to it. Just drag and drop, and then, like I said, provide the connect string, drag and drop the execute, provide the SQL. Now the next thing I want to do is execute these tests for you. So let's go over to the test set and make that happen. Here we are in our test set. You can see that I have my suite pulled into the test set with sections for PowerServer, PowerBuilder, and PowerClient. We might notice that the last time this test set was executed, the PowerServer tests had failed and the others have passed. Let's mark them now and see how they go this time. I'm going to go ahead and run them for you. Go ahead and put my build number in. Now we're going to see the PowerServer application come up first. And it's going to add another bicycle to the database. Every time that it executes, it's actually going to also check the database. So it not only verifies against the GUI, but as you saw a little bit earlier in the presentation, check the database as well. That was the PowerBuilder that ran, and now the PowerClient. So we're running the same exact set of tests, no changes are necessary, against PowerBuilder, and then the two deployments, the PowerServer and the PowerClient. And this time all of our test cases did pass. That's indicated by the green check mark here. If we click on any one of them and we come down below here, we can see the trace of the test run. You can see every action that was taken inside of each one of the steps. The steps are in bold, black type, and then the actions are all in a lighter blue type. We'd like to see how the verification actually occurred. We can double click on this line and you can see what was expected. Those were the values that I expected to be in the database, and those were the values that actually were written to the database. So those results are really for the person who executed the test, but if you want to generate reports, you can go up to the results menu, say generate report, and you can pick from a number of reports. I can pick a detailed report that goes all the way down to the trace level. Click OK, and AscentialTest will generate the report for me. And of course we can export those reports to any platform that you might want to distribute them on. All right, let's return to the slides now and we'll take a look at some support for new PowerBuilder features. Let's take a look now at some recent enhancements in PowerBuilder and the AscentialTest support for them. I'm sure you're all familiar with the new ribbon bar or ribbon window, and what I've done is I've taken a snapshot of the sales demo application, focusing on the ribbon at the top part of the main window. You can see over here in the elements tree that AscentialTest recognizes the sections. So we see the individual sections, and then of course all of the items in those sections. And just like any other object in AscentialTest, you can just simply take and drag and drop. What I've done is I've dragged over the ribbon window itself, and you can see the ribbon bar there. And I chose to put all of the items underneath the ribbon bar directly. I've seen other customers take the sections and drag them over, and then drag over the individual items in those sections inside of the sections themselves. That's entirely up to you. it'll work either way. As you know, AscentialTest does not care about the hierarchy of the application, but if you prefer to define the objects that way, that's fine. So our support for the ribbon bar is actually better than it was for the old PB toolbar, because in that case you needed to use render image. You needed to capture an image in order to recognize the individual tools inside of the toolbar. Another recent addition is REST. And along with PowerBuilder now supporting REST, Xenix supports REST as well. And in order to support REST, we've introduced a few new classes. We've introduced the JSON array class, the JSON object class, and then the REST class. So with these three classes, you can read, write, parse, manipulate your JSON, and then you can use the REST class in order to communicate with a REST server and send a request and evaluate the response. You can see in the class there are actions to connect, to add headers, to submit a full request, and so forth. Finally, I think many of you might know that AscentialTest has always supported IE built into a PowerBuilder application, but now we're supporting the embedded Chrome inside of a PowerBuilder application. And you can see in this snapshot, this is a snapshot of an application that Chris Pollock gave to me. It's a PowerBuilder application. But inside the PowerBuilder application, you can see that there is this web page, this Chrome page. And if you look over here in the elements tree, you can see that in fact it's a PB form and there's some PB compute and push buttons and so forth in the snapshot. But there's also a web page in the snapshot, and inside the web page, all of the web elements. So support for Chrome here inside of the PowerBuilder application is the same level of support that we provide for testing a application running inside of a Chrome browser. In summary, I gave you a pretty good introduction to AscentialTest. You've learned about creating application objects for a PowerBuilder application. I discussed building automated steps and tests. And then we saw how we can run a single set of tests against a PowerBuilder, a PowerServer, and a PowerClient application. And just now we looked at some support for some recent PowerBuilder features, including the ribbons, REST, and the embedded Chrome. Hope you've enjoyed this presentation. It is now your time to ask any questions that you might have.